Well, good morning, everyone. As everyone's coming in, we get started here in just a minute. It's always kind of sad to have to interrupt all the good fellowship that's going on. First of all, thanks for being here. If you're online, I appreciate you tuning in. Today we're going to start a two-part lesson. We're continuing with our Through the Lens of Matthew, but today we're going to start a two-part lesson on the Sermon on the Mount. Excuse me. And if you know anything about that, obviously 2 lessons is probably really cutting that short. Probably could easily do a whole quarter, if not a year, just on the Sermon on the Mount. But for lack of time, we're gonna try to cover that in 2 weeks. A couple of things, I'd probably be amiss if I didn't mention this, and I'm not trying to embarrass them by saying this, but Tyrone and Alma here are, what day did you celebrate? 60 years, right? 61. Today, 61-year wedding anniversary, so I wish Alma was here. I think we're all thinking the same thing as how she puts up with Tyrone for 61 years, but congratulations, that's great. Before I get started today, too, I wanted to kind of tell you something that's somewhat special to me. And those of you that are native Houstonians, this will probably be make a little sense to y'all, too. But when my wife and I were married back in July of 1992, that first Christmas, her grandparents gave me Matthew, a commentary from Burton Kaufman, who a lot of you, as I was mentioning, if you're Houstonians, you'll know him. I think when I was looking, he was with the Central Church of Christ, maybe. Excuse me, Central Church of Christ. So every birthday and every Christmas for the next several years until they passed, they kept giving me the next volume in his set. And after they passed, her parents picked that up. And some years ago, I finally got the very last copy of the full New Testament, Old Testament. So it has been a great help, but I wish they were still here. I think they would love to have been able to hear that I'm using their very first one to teach with, and he's come in so handy with me through the years. And even on Matthew, when I run into something that I'm just not sure about or want to get another opinion, the series by Burton Kaufman has been really a help. Excuse me. All right, Sermon on the Mount. There we go. Excuse me. Found in chapters 5 through 7. Let me get a quick drink here. And Jesus, when we talk about him, he wasn't really a preacher in the sense necessarily that we think about preachers today. You know, not all of them, but most of our preachers today are paid they have a set church that they work for. They're paid by that church. They're under the guidance of that elders there. But Jesus obviously was a little bit different, didn't have any of that. It was really just more of an impromptu teaching. When I looked at the Sermon on the Mount, we call that a sermon. For me to stand up, I tried that. It took me about 12 minutes to go through the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm thinking about something that comes to me is how much, Jesus, we know that at times he spoke for days on end. At one time, the people had been out with him for 3 days. And I think about what all we're missing when the Sermon on the Mount, if you think about just what's contained in that 12 minutes compared to what the many days and hours and even years of stuff that we don't have from our Lord. It's probably incredible what he could do with such a short time. A couple of notes here. The Sermon on the Mount is by far Jesus' longest kind of one talk or explanation of what it looks like to serve as a member of his kingdom, to be his follower. They represent really the major ideals of a Christian life. He kind of summarized a whole bunch of different lessons in that 12 minutes. There were things in there such as prayer. He talked about justice, care for the needy, handling of religious laws, marriage, divorce, fasting, judging other people, salvation. And as you mentioned, really a lot more even than that, but those are a couple of the highlights of it. So an overview Really, in the end, Jesus made it clear that his followers should live really different. He didn't tell them just to obey the laws, but he told them to exceed the laws. He put them to a much higher standard of conduct, a standard of love and selfishness that Jesus himself embodied. Especially we see that on the cross. Really, a lot of his commands are taking what was in the law and saying, well, this is what the law said, but we're going to kind of step it up a bit. We're going to look at some of those today. You know, when he talked about murder, he didn't just say it's wrong to murder. He said it's wrong just to have it in your heart, to even hate your brother. Another one, adultery. You know, it said it's not just wrong to commit adultery. It's wrong to even lust in your heart. So that really set the tone for a much higher standard that we're going to see with the establishment of the church as opposed to just the Jewish law. All right, for that day, who was the audience when, I'm sorry, that's kind of a little too. Really, it seems to be both his disciples and the multitude. In 5:1 it says, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he seated, his disciples came to him. And then he started preaching. And at the very end, 7:28, it says, and so it was that when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teachings. What makes it, too, I think, interesting, the ethnic groups were talked about. They're mentioned here, some of them. So I looked some of those up to see exactly what they would be referenced to. In 4:25, it says, and great multitudes followed him from Galilee, which we mentioned up here, could be mixture of Jews and Gentiles, from Decapolis, mostly a Gentile area, from Jerusalem and Judea, both probably Jews there. And then anything that's typically referenced beyond the Jordan, we would reference that as being a Gentile nation or Gentile people. And something just that I found interesting up here is that Matthew himself mentions some of these Gentile areas first before the Jews, even though we know Matthew was a Jew and was written to the Jews. A couple of reasons, I'm not sure really why he did that or if there's any significance at all, but some things that came to mind was that maybe he was trying to emphasize the acceptance of the Gentiles, or maybe another reason was that the makeup was mainly Gentiles, so he mentioned that first. Who was he speaking to? Most of these people would have been just your common, ordinary people. I think that's the reason he used so many parables, is that they could really understand those. Examples, there would have been fishermen, farmers, shepherds, laborers, business owners, just a wide variety of people that would be out there. And we see based upon his message, it's one that's addressed both to believers and non-believers. Another question is, that's come to my mind is why would these people all come? What was their driving force to a man that really carries no political clout? He was a part of the Pharisees or the Sadducees for the religious elite. He was just like, most of them called him a prophet. So what drove those people to come out there? We see later some of them came in, and we mentioned, stayed for days on end. Would give up food. He ended up having to feed the group on a couple different occasions. But just a couple things I jotted down, and you probably have some, may have came out for curiosity's sake. Just they had heard a lot about him. Just wanted to come out and see what this man was that was doing these preachings. And we know that he was healing a lot of people. Some of them may strictly just came out to see if they could get healed or bring a loved one to get healed. Maybe they had previously heard him and really liked what he had to say and wanted to see what else he would say. And maybe some come out just to see maybe some miracles that he was going to perform. We really don't know. Just speculation on maybe what drew him out there that day. Probably one of the best known things when you look at the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, quoted a lot. And I found it interesting. I looked up this word for blessed. It has several different meanings in the Greek. Makarios is the word, if I'm pronouncing that right. But a lot of times it is pronounced, or it's translated as kind of a happy, and a happy in the sense of not giddy happy, but happy in the sense of what most people are trying to get in their lives. That's why I was, it's the age-old question of what can I do to be happy, or what do I need to do to be happy? People are always searching for what will make them happy. I mentioned up here, it's just as relevant to someone sitting in an office in New York City as it was relevant to those villagers that day. Everyone wants to know, what can I do to be happy? And really, his answer, what he's going to answer in a few minutes on what they need to do, flies in the face of it. So I went out to Amazon and just did a search on what can I do to be happy, or what makes me happy. And just on the first listing, there were over 2,000 books that came up. YouTube had thousands of videos. They were from celebrities, authors, motivational speakers. And this last one here at first kind of caught my attention. I thought it was kind of comical, but literally there was a convicted murderer that wrote from jail on what it takes to be happy. But the more I thought about that, I thought if a guy in jail, a convicted murderer, can figure out what it means to be happy in the right context of what it means to be happy, it might be worth listening to. All right, again, hopefully you can read those. So let's start just looking at these. We'll just kind of do a quick run through of the different Beatitudes out there. And again, these are blessed are or happy are those people. It starts off poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. As we're doing these, something I want you to concentrate on that I think made a little bit of difference when I was looking at it is look at the rewards for each of these and concentrate on what the rewards are. Because I think if we could really get that into our mind, that some of the rewards that we can get by doing these, I think maybe would motivate us to actually get out and do some of these things or try to make changes in our life. Because look at the first one. This really, blessed are the poor in spirit, carries this thought of being humble. True humility, as I've got here, is understanding that you are nothing without God. Excuse me. Must be, humble to allow God to control our lives. But look at the reward for that. Reward for being humble is kingdom of heaven. And a lot of these, if you look at our world, they wouldn't put much value in these things. But God tells us that by being humble, we get some incredible rewards for just being humble. But all these that we're looking at. Second one, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And I think this mourning really carries kind of three types. I think there's the mourning for yourself. If maybe you've lost a loved one, or you've got health issues or something like that, so you're mourning for yourself or for someone around you. There's a mourning, I think, that we should be doing for our soul, the state of our soul. When we sin, there should be a mourning that we're doing for the fact that we sin. And then we've got the mourning for others. We might also call that empathy, where we're talking about those others are mourning around us, so we kind of come close to them and try to empathize or try to mourn with them. Really, it's mourning is we mentioned that our sinful nature it implies a love for people, and the reward for mourning is God's comfort. So I think just the fact that we know that if we are mourning, that God is going to comfort us is a great reward. All right, well, there's one for blessed are the meek, another one that our world doesn't put much value in. Talked about being meek is one that manifests self-control, faithful to God, that requires a lot of self-control. But how does the world view meekness? Typically it's viewed as being timid, weak, not something to be sought after.
I think it takes an older person to appreciate it.
That's right.
The younger you are, the less that makes sense.
That's right. Good point. So his point was that as we get older, we come to appreciate that more, and that's a good point. But look at the reward for that, for meekness, though. The world says if you're meek, you're probably at the lower level, that's not something to be attained. But here he's telling you if you're meek, that the reward for that is inheriting the earth.
The world looks at that as being, like Casper milk toast, just
That's a good point. Yeah, she was again reiterating how the world views meekness as someone that's, in her words, kind of like milk toast or someone. Good. That's a good point. Thank you. All right, and 5:6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. You know, I kind of compared this to going without food or water. You know, the longer we go with those, the more the craving sets in on those. And our goal with this one is obviously to always do what's right in God's eyes, to hunger for his righteousness, to be in a oneness with God. And this reward, again, is another great one if we seek after God, where it says we're going to find him. 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Again, mercy sometimes in this world is not a trait that's sought after a lot, but it's things like treating people with kindness, treating people with compassion and forgiveness, not being cruel or harsh. And that can be difficult today with people out there. So many people are just, what's best for me? What can I do to get ahead? That they don't think about things like compassion and forgiveness and treating people correctly. It's really all that I can get for me. What's the reward for being merciful? It says we'll receive mercy from God, something that obviously we all understand that without mercy we're going to be nothing without God's grace. So definitely to receive that, it's telling us here we've got to be willing to show it to others outside the world. 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What a great reward here by being pure in heart, to be able to know that you'll be able to see God. Pure in heart, mentioned here, means we need to be free of all selfish purposes, self-seeking motives. And again, Jesus was the ultimate example of this, as he sacrificed his own life in redemption for us and for mankind. And again, the reward will be that we'll be able to see God. All right, 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Another great reward, son of God. Peacemakers, I mentioned, not only manifest peaceful lives, but also work to share peace and friendship with others, to cultivate peace between God and man. And obviously, I mentioned the reward to be called a son of God. What a great thing to be able to be called son of God. And that is, you know, I think if we could ever get that, it's another one of those things that if we could really internalize that you know, God is just not saying you're going to be a part of me. He's saying you're going to be an adopted son or an adopted daughter of us. And for those of you that have been a part of adoptions, I think that would even mean more to you. But just the fact that God is going to adopt us as sons and daughters, and the rewards that come with that is him being our Father, is an incredible thing to think about. 5:10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Again, these kingdom, we talked about last week, the kingdom, all these could be, you know, the kingdom we saw last week could be a reference to the church or heaven as our eternal home. Jesus said many times that those who follow him will be persecuted. A good reference, John 15:20, 21, if they persecute me, they will persecute you. The reward is that even if we're wrongfully persecuted for our belief or devotion to God, we shall be blessed eternally with the kingdom of heaven. Another one to think about today is we're going to look at this a little more, but you know, how much persecution do we get these days in our life? What's the reason maybe if we're not persecuted, why aren't we persecuted? Is it because people don't see Christ in us? Maybe so, that were reason. I know that in talking to Tyrone and some of those about some of the foreign countries, you know, those people really have persecution. And it's incredible what some of God's people around the world are having to endure. 5:13 and 16 through 16. And I've mentioned this because I think it's a continuation of what I'm just mentioning here with the 8 Beatitudes. This one is, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world, a city that is set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify God in heaven. I mentioned, I think this is a continuation, I believe, of the last beatitude, and talks about highlights some of the persecution, or the fact that if we're not salt in this earth and we're not light to people around us, I think it's going back to that verse that we're probably not going to be persecuted. So what does being a light, what does being salt really look like in our lives? Excuse me. Some things I jotted down. I think that's how we treat others, how we handle adversity in our life. When people see things going on in our life that's difficult, how do we handle that? Are we honest and truthful in our jobs or in our dealings with people? Do people see that in our lives? You know, things like, what do we watch? What do we read? What are we looking at online? Those kind of things are a difference, I think, between the salt and the light. He tells us, you know, that if you're salt, but it loses its flavor, it's really worthless. Same thing with the light. If it's put under, we used to sing a little song, put it under a bushel and put the light out. But without, you know, living it out, it's really has no value. Another one, do we do our jobs the best we can? I know there are people that are in jobs that maybe they don't particularly enjoy, but instead of, you know, griping and complaining, are you doing your job the best that you can for the Lord? Are we caring for others? Do we help those around us? Are we dependable? And lastly, do we talk about our faith with others? So really, I guess all those kind of come around to the thing that when people see us, what do they see in us? Do they see Christ in us? Do they want to ask us about that? Or do they just see an ordinary person that that's got no distinction from between the next person that they run into? Here's Jesus' answer to the question of why am I here? I think a lot of people were probably wondering that question. Maybe they came out wanting to know, what's this man going to be doing? What's his reason for being here? I think probably based on some of the responses we've seen in other places, a couple things I thought about. They may have came out thinking he's eventually going to be an earthly king. Maybe he's going to be the one that's going to liberate them from Rome. You know, they were under a lot of oppression with Rome in those days. Maybe he's going to be the one that's going to come out and liberate them from that. Maybe he's going to lead a revolt himself. You know, we know that a lot of the Jews were especially thinking that most of what Jesus was here to do was from an earthly standpoint, to lead them out of this oppression.
Kind of in addition to that, they thought that he was going to restore Israel to its once greatness. That's what they believed the prophecies were, that it wasn't just freedom from Rome, it was to restore Israel as the nation that everybody is feared of and looks to.
Good, thank you, Stephen. So if you couldn't hear him, he said, on top of that, probably the main reason was that they really believed that he was here to restore Jerusalem, to restore the Jewish people to what they once were, to be this great nation. So I think you're right. That's a good point on what they... But let's look at what Jesus really says about why he gets this attention. Here he gets their attention with what he said. Look at what he says in 5:17-18. Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. So I mentioned here he spelled out his own authority as being the fulfillment of the law, and making sure they understood that he was not here to destroy the law. And I think that destroy carries what you were talking about as being, not only was he not here to destroy the law, but he wasn't here to destroy or try to destroy Rome or anything, is what they were hoping, I think. And I think I've got this starred on mine, but what was missed by most of the audience was that by fulfilling the law, he was in essence removing the law. Because upon his death, the church would be ushered in and the old law would be voided. Obviously, I don't think any of those people at that time understood that completely. But I think it's interesting that in the fact of his death would actually bring an end to the law and usher in the new age. And then the end of this, I didn't print that part, but in the end, he takes another jab at the Pharisees by telling them that the righteousness must exceed theirs, which is he was referring back to earlier, in order for them to even enter the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to have a whole lesson on Jesus and his interactions with the Pharisees, but he is not nice, maybe we could say, with his dealings with the Pharisees, and tends to use them as a lot of examples and a lot of times put a jab in on the Pharisees for the way they were acting. 5:21 through 32, we're going to take a look at this in a little more detail. This is really where he gets into the ones we talked about earlier. You know, the law says don't murder, but I say. The law says don't commit adultery, but I say. The law says this about treating people, but I say this. And if we think about this, you know, we mentioned that Jesus really wasn't a part of the religious elite and such. So probably, I would think most of the people, when they heard this, thought these teachings would be pretty bold and sensational. Jesus is essentially saying the law says this, as I mentioned, but I'm saying this, plus it is, but plus a whole lot more. And coming from a relatively unknown prophet, this would have been quite daring for him to say. Because in a sense, he's pointing out the weakness of the law, and with all these scribes and Pharisees present, I think they would have got the point that he was, again, taking another jab at them by saying, here's the law, and this is what y'all have learned. But I'm going to add to it and make it much fuller. Because he would have known, you know, they were known for their strict observances and points of the law, and felt they knew everything about it. And this would have probably completely leveled their thinking when he starts saying that, you know, the law is really not complete. All right, we mentioned this one, but this is the start of it. Matthew 5:21 and 22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. I found it interesting, that phrase there after brother without a cause, some of the translations don't include that. So without that, it would say, but I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment. So it changes it a little bit. Without a cause would tend to say that, you know, there may be times when anger with the brother is okay or acceptable, but the other translation makes it seem like more that you can't be angry with your brother at all. Right, I think that you're right. Be angry and sin not. So. All right, good point. So again, I think you're exactly right here. There are times for anger, but it's how we handle that anger and the attitude that we're taking. That's the importance. All right, sins against a brother. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. And I think this one is a difficult one too here. Really, Jesus is making the point that our first duty is to make things right with our brother, even more important than worship. Because again, this goes back to these, God is saying, or Jesus is saying, here's the law, but I want to put in a piece. It's really about the heart. And I think this is a difficult one. You know, at times people say things, at times people may treat us one way or another, and it's difficult sometimes to handle that or get over that. So, and he's really saying that your worship is not meaningful to me if you've got an issue with your brother that's unresolved. This one we've touched on also, adultery, 5:27 through 28. You have heard that it was said that in days of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery for her in his heart. And this is just a note I put up here, but a few verses in the Bible I think can prick the heart of, I'm speaking from the viewpoint obviously of a man, can prick the heart of a man. And you could see they talked about that these Pharisees used to go around a lot of these things. They were so puffed up and so emboldened that they would claim they haven't murdered, they haven't, committed adultery, but yet I forgot to mention this back around murder, but on murder, they would go along that at times they could say, well, I haven't ever committed murder, but yet they were hoping that this person would die by an accident or die in war or die some other reason, and felt that that was okay as long as they didn't actually have a hand in it. They could still wish them ill will. And I think this is another one that's just difficult. It went from something that would have applied to some people to something that applies to us all. This fight with our mind, with lust, is difficult. And now this commandment, he broadens all these commands. They were very specific. Now, much broader command that applies just about every one of us. (5:31 and 32). Furthermore, it has been said that whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. And if I mentioned up here, this verse typically we're hearing it used in the relationship of marriage and divorce and when it's allowed and so forth. But I really think that this verse, is much higher than that. I think it's definitely mentioned in there on the marriage and divorce part. But I think what it's really doing when he starts off, that I think it's giving a much more value to marriage. It's saying marriage is much more important. I looked up, and the Pharisees back in those days, and there were laws, they could divorce. Typically, it was the man divorcing the wife for all kinds of little nitpicky reasons. I think God here is trying to say marriage is far more important than maybe you guys are putting the emphasis on.
That's the biggest problem the church has, in my opinion, my humble opinion. If you don't have marriage, when I was a child growing up, there was no divorce. It was unheard of. And today, they have marriage seminars in the church that coach people to divorce. Typically, the women divorcing their husband. And, that's the way it is. We're supposed to be different, but we're not.
You're right.
The statistics are the same, and that is an abomination. And I did prison ministry for 48 years, and those boys are in prison because their parents did not get married and stay married and raise them.
Good, thank you. So he was talking about, mainly that we need to be seen as different, not only in this area of marriage and divorce, but in our lives. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is we need to be different. All right, swearing, 5:33 and 30 through 37. Again, you've heard it was said of old, you should not swear falsely, but you shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair black or white. Again, referencing this swearing is not necessarily in reference to what we would consider language or cussing, though that certainly applies just as much. But really the gist of this is that our word needs to be our bond. We need to be, he's saying there's no need to go in here and have to swear by all these different things for people to believe that you're actually telling the truth, that your truth, what your word is, needs to be your truth. Again, really this one is to do more than expected. We know this. I think we're starting to run a little close on time. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2, and give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you. And do not turn away. Again, more verses that take the old commands and really are expanding on them. One time I did find that was interesting, this issue of being compelled to go a mile. From what I could find is that the Roman soldiers were allowed to compel someone, Jewish people, which obviously would be, their hatred for Rome. So these soldiers could compel them to carry their stuff and go, but the limit was supposed to be a mile that you could compel a person to do this. So basically Jesus is saying, hey, if they can take you a mile, be willing to go 2 miles with them. Another one that's difficult for us, loving your enemies. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? Again, making it much more difficult. The command originally says, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. And for most people, that's pretty easy to do. If your neighbor, especially if you got good neighbors, it's easy to love them, and it's easy to hate your neighbors, right? But hate your enemies. But he's really turning that upside down on its head and saying, no, not only should you love the people that are easy to love, but you got to love the people, that are really difficult to love. Then he throws in an interesting verse here in 5:48. That we'll look at just quickly. It says, therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So a couple of questions that came to my mind when I read this. One, is perfection attainable? Would Jesus ask something of us that we couldn't achieve? What does perfection look like? Here's a couple of my thoughts and looking at that. First of all, it's required of us from this verse, but it's not something we can ever attain on our own. We're never going to be perfect on our own. I think this verse on perfection serves as a reminder of just how unworthy we are of salvation. He wants us to be perfect. We can never be perfect except through him. Again, but I think it's in the striving for perfection where we move closer and closer to God. As we put the effort to try to be more perfect, to be more like God, that's how we draw closer to God. Again, only when we are viewed through the blood of Jesus Christ can we really attain perfection. The question is, how do we get that? How do we get in the blood of Jesus Christ? We do that through belief, through confessing his name, repenting of our sins, being baptized with him for the forgiveness of our sins, and living a Christ-centered life. So can we achieve perfection one day? I think the answer to that is certainly yes. I don't think he would give us something we couldn't do. But again, it's got to be something that we're working toward, with the realization, though, that the only way it's going to ever happen is him viewing us and being viewed through the blood of Jesus Christ. All right, 6:1-4, starting in chapter 6 now. Again, this section I've entitled, God is the focus, not the world, and it's in our deeds. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So here it's really all about the motive of what we're doing. Why are you doing the deeds? Why are you are you doing them to be seen by others? We know there's several examples. The Pharisees were, they would be out doing things just to be, so other people could see kind of how great they were, how much they're doing. But Jesus, in mentioning this, talks about, to make sure the heart's in the right place. In practice, we talked about this can be really difficult. And we should always, I mentioned we should always reward or long for an eternal reward over a an earthly reward. I think actually I'm going to just stop here because I'll pick this up because this one we're going to deal with. I didn't change it here, but we'll just do that. Starting next week, we're going to look at prayer. This one has several slides involved, and I think I'll run us over if we did that. So, thank you certainly for your comments. Thank you for your attention, and hope you'll come back next week. We're going to pick up chapter or lesson 2 on this, and we'll start with prayer. So, if you'll join me in a quick prayer, then we'll be out for today.